Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday worship. My name is Thomas. I'm part of the pastoral staff here. A couple of caveats before we begin the message. I'm a little bit under the weather today, so if I say anything crazy, it's either the spirit or the sickness. So whatever you can choose, whichever it is. Hope to see all of you guys also today as we go to the park. Great way for us to meet each other and to chat with one another in a different context. I hope you also go to our prayer gatherings. If you haven't gone to a prayer gathering this year, you're a terrible person, so make sure you come to at least this one today. Again, the sickness or the spirits, it's one of those that's kind of coming out. But yeah, I hope you can come. This is a year we want to pray, we want to gather together, and we really hope, even though it's been a long day, that we could make space for us to pray as a church. And if this is your first time here, we are in the middle of a sermon series through the book of Leviticus, the least read and the least known book in the Bible. We are halfway done through this series. We are going to go through it for another 3 weeks or so. And this is our way as a church of a reminder. If you ever question, does this church preach through the whole counsel of God? Yes, we do. We are going through Leviticus. And so, given that, we actually are going to be looking at Leviticus chapters 11 to 15. And we're going to start with chapter 10, actually, but it's going to mainly be through 11 to 15. We're going to look at different sections of Leviticus. It should be in your programs. And here at our church, we believe that when we read the scriptures, our God is alive and is speaking. So can we all rise together as we read through Leviticus, starting in chapter 10, verse 10, and we'll go all the way to chapter 15, verse 32. So starting in chapter 10, verse 10, it writes, "You must distinguish between the holy and the common, and the clean and the unclean, and teach the Israelites all the statutes that the Lord has given to them through Moses. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, 'Tell the Israelites, you may eat all these kinds of land animals. You may eat any animal with divided hooves that chews to cud. This is what you may eat from all that is in the water. You may eat everything in the water that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or streams. But these are to be abhorrent to you, everything in the seas or streams that does not have fins and scales. You are to abhor these birds. They must not be eaten because they are abhorrent. Eagles, bearded vultures, Egyptian vultures. Do not eat any of the creatures that swarm on the earth, anything that moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet, for they are abhorrent. For I am the Lord your God, so you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. So you must be holy, because I am holy. The Lord spoke to Moses, 'Tell the Israelites, when a woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a male child, she will be unclean 7 days, as she is during the days of her menstrual impurity.' The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, 'When a person has swelling or scab or spot in the skin of his body, and it may be a serious disease in the skin of his body, he is to be brought to the priest Aaron or to one of his sons, the priest. The priest will examine the sore on the skin of his body. If the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is in fact a serious skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean." Chapter 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, "This is the law concerning the person afflicted with a skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp and examine him. The skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person. The priest will order 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, be brought for the one who is to be cleansed." In chapter 15, verse 32. "This is the law for someone with a discharge, a man who has the emission of semen becoming unclean by it, and a woman who is in her menstrual period, anyone who has a discharge, whether male or female, and a man who sleeps with a woman who is unclean." This is the reading of God's word. Let's all pray. Father, as we read this text, I'm sure for a lot of us, if we're paying attention to it, it could feel so removed and strange. But I do pray, O Lord, that we could, as the people of God, trust that you have something to say to us today, at this time, in this moment, in this space. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You may be seated. Have you ever had a foreigner point out to you things that we do in America that seems so normal to us, and yet it's actually pretty strange and it's a uniquely American thing? I remember years ago, my family and I, we hosted my cousins from Korea, and we asked them, "How has the U.S. been during your visit and stay?" And they mentioned they love the U.S. They think it's, in many ways, so much better than their home country. And yet they did notice there's some things that Americans did that are really weird. And when we mentioned, like, well, what are some things you noticed? Because that's always fascinating, because I don't think we're weird, but they noticed that the things we just presume is normal is kind of strange. And they mentioned, why do Americans, they always smile at each other? Like when you see a stranger, they just like smile. That is so anti-Asian. But in America, you just see someone, you smile. And there's I actually read on a Reddit thread, they're asking that question, why do Americans smile at each other? And they said, in any other country, if you see someone smiling at you, someone you don't know, they're either drunk, insane, or an American. Another thing they noticed, my cousins, is they said, why do Americans make everything so big? Everything is produced in such a mass level. For example, food. The portions are huge. No wonder this country struggles with diabetes. It's crazy how large the portions are. Then you don't need to have that large of a portion. Why does America do that? Or why do Americans do small talk? When you're in a grocery store, you're just standing in line, someone just turns around going, crazy weather, right? It's what? Why are you talking to me? We think it's so normal, and yet everyone outside the country is that's actually really strange. And yet, while these customs are strange to them and normal to us, there's actually a story behind why Americans do this. I don't know if you guys know, but I looked it up, and you know why Americans, they smile at each other, even though they don't know each other? It's because most countries where there's a lot of immigration, the main thing you had to rely upon was nonverbal communication. And America is literally founded by immigrants. And so most of the communication you have to have with each other is just to smile, just to show you're a friendly person, because you can't verbalize who you are and what you're about. So that's kind of the baseline of how Americans communicated back in the day. Or why are there large portions that Americans have? It's not just because we want to give people a lot of food, but in reality, post-World War II, farmers were able to grow produce a lot more cheaply, and that's why the serving sizes increased so that we could gain more profit, because it's really cheap to make, might as well make more money. Or why is it that we do small talk? Why do Americans love that? It's because, as one author writes, there's a thing called coconut culture and peach culture. Ever heard that before? Coconut culture means tough to crack, but once you're in, you're in. That's like Asians, right? It's hard to break into an Asian community because they're locked in. But once you're in, you are in. Versus in more of a Western context, it's so easy to feel friendly. It's like a peach culture. It's like a peach. You go in, but there's a hard center. It's hard to get deep. It's hard to really know the person. And that's kind of the story behind these different customs that are there. And the reason I bring this up is because when we read Leviticus, man, is it just filled with strange customs, weird things that are going on? I mean, even the text we just read, it's so bizarre and kind of hard to understand. It's a little bit cringy. Why are we talking about animals and clean, unclean, and bodily fluids? What is going on here? This seems so strange and foreign to modern audiences. And again, if you read this on the surface, you'll get nothing out of it. If you read Leviticus 11 to 15 by yourself and just go through it, it will just go over your head, and you'll think this is just part of the reason why the Bible is strange to me, and why Christianity is just a foreign thing that I just cannot really have a hard time fully embracing. And yet, if you're willing to do the hard work and just pausing a little bit and discovering that there's actually a story behind these seemingly strange customs that are there, it could illuminate the rest of the Bible and what Christianity is about for both those who are seeking and those who've been in the faith their whole life. The purpose of these different laws that we just read, the chapters 11 to 15, these laws are not for Christians for us to follow today, which we'll talk about a little bit why. We are not meant to read this and go oh, this is what I'm supposed to do today. That is not the purpose of these laws, but it was given to ancient Israel to show them what it means to be holy. Again, to provide a little bit of context, remember, in the book of Leviticus, the context is Yahweh, he brought Israel out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. They've been camping at Mount Sinai for a while. He instructed them to build a tabernacle where God's presence would dwell. And when his presence would dwell there, he wants to draw close to them. He wants to be in relationship with Israel. But the big problem is God is holy, Israel is not. How can a holy God dwell with an unholy people? And so Leviticus has been that whole answer. Yahweh's been providing a pathway. We saw in the book of Leviticus from the very beginning that Yahweh, he offers it in chapters 1 to 7, this thing called offerings. If you want to approach God and be in his presence, you have to bring offerings. An animal has to be sacrificed to come in near to him. And then we saw in chapter 8 to 10, we saw that there's something called the priesthood was established, where there's a certain type of people who are to come and bring the offerings into this tabernacle. But last week, if you were with us, you'll know that Leviticus chapter 10 ended on a sour note. Even though, we have offerings, we have the priests, the presence of God, we could be with them. Chapter 10 ends where the sons of Aaron, they died. They were priests, and they entered God's presence, and God killed them. They died in his very presence. And Yahweh, he's going to use this as an opportunity to teach Israel, you have to be holy to come in my presence. This is an idea that Yahweh wants to pound over and over again. And chapter 11 to 15, this is God teaching Israel what holy lives look like and why and how a holy life enters into the presence of a holy God. And this is how it relates to us today. I mentioned before, for a lot of us here, Leviticus, even though it seems so removed, it's such a relevant book for us because a lot of us here, we believe in God. We even subscribe to God, but we don't feel close to him. He feels like a distant being, a distant figure in our lives. And Leviticus is trying to tell us there's a way where God can feel close. In fact, God creates a way for us to be close. And somehow these obscure laws that we just read, these seemingly weird things that are here, it could unlock this idea of how we can draw near and experience his presence. Because through these laws, we learn this concept of holiness. And again, if you want to be with a holy God, we have to learn how to be a holy people. And so last week we talked about what holiness is. It's to be set apart. Today, we're going to look a little bit about how to live a holy life. And so we're going to do this in three ways. Number one, we have to understand this idea of clean and unclean, understanding clean and unclean. Two, understanding holiness. And then three, understanding Jesus. So understanding holiness, understanding clean and unclean, understanding holiness, and then understanding Jesus. Let's look at the first point. Understanding clean and unclean. So before we get into the actual body of this text, there are some things that we should a framework or a context that will help us fully understand what's going on in these kind of obscure passages. One of the things we have to understand is, again, this idea of tabernacle. If you've been with us the past few weeks, we've been just hammering down this idea of tabernacle over and over again. This is your first time here. It's great to just remember, have a little bit of context what this is. The tabernacle, and this is a picture of it, this is the tent that Israel dwelled in the wilderness in Mount Sinai, and this is what's going to journey with them throughout the wilderness. They set up this tent with this, and the whole idea of the tabernacle is that this is not a synagogue, it is not a portable church, but it was the idea that this is where heaven and earth met. It's where the very presence of God dwelled, and the entire tabernacle was designed to look like Eden. The whole design is with brightly colors and with making sure that it reflected heaven. It's meant to be where God's presence is. And you'll notice, again, a tabernacle, it's kind of revolves around this thing called holy spaces, where you have the most holy place where God's actual presence dwells. And then you have the holy place, which is kind of the outer realm of where God dwells. And then you have the courtyard. And outside the courtyard, you have the camp where all the Israelites are camped out. And then outside of that, you have the wilderness and the Gentiles and the nations that's there. And what's important to understand about the tabernacle and the Israelite mind is the closer you get to the most holy place, the closer you get to God's presence, is order in life. This idea that there is order, wholeness, life, everything that is good, it is in the tabernacle. And the more you draw near, the more pure and good it has to be. And the further you walk away from the tabernacle, the further you walk away from God's presence, you get chaos, death. Literally, the wilderness is there. And that's meant to communicate a point that this is what the tabernacle is about. Eden in God's presence is where we find peace and shalom, what our hearts are longing for. And the further away you are from God's presence, you actually find the chaos that we're all very familiar with called life. That's the first key term we have to understand, tabernacle. Here's the second key terms we have to understand. This idea of holy and common, clean and unclean. Maybe some of us heard this growing up in the church. Maybe some of us haven't. But let's get ready to unpack this term a little bit. Chapter 10, verse 10, if you guys look in your verses again, let's look at this one more time. Yahweh is talking to Israel. He says this to them. You must distinguish between the holy and the common and the clean and the unclean. Let's lay it out. What does Yahweh mean by that? There are two things. Holy and common. To be holy, again, is to be set apart, something that belongs to God. To be common, it literally means from dirt or from the earth. It's anything that does not belong to God. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not being used for God. For example, if I have some type of tray that's used for communion, you could almost, in our eyes, see that as holy. It's used for the church. Versus if I have another tray that's the exact same way and it's serving punch at the park, that's not maybe as holy because it's not used directly for the church. That's kind of the idea. There's things that are holy, set apart for God, things that are common that aren't used for God. Nothing's bad about it. It's just a little bit different. That's the first category we can understand. Now, underneath that category of common, you have this thing called clean and unclean. To be clean is something common that's in its ideal state. Just imagine a spoon that's just newly made. You could use it. You could feed yourself, feed your kids with it. Clean. Unclean is something that is polluted, that is not ideal. It's a bent spoon, a dirty spoon, something that's just not you would use at all. That's something that is considered unclean. Now, when something common becomes holy, that's called sanctification. When something unclean becomes clean, that's called purification. And as something clean becomes unclean, that's called defilement. These are just different categories of how Israel understood things. This is clean, this is unclean. That's common, that's holy. Anything unclean cannot be holy. It has to at least be clean in order to be considered holy. I would never use a dirty spoon to feed my daughter food. If it's clean, I might use it depending how nice that spoon is, right? That's kind of the idea of how Israelites understood and used these categories. Now, here's the third thing. Here's the problem of clean and unclean. Even though something is unclean, that doesn't mean it's sinful. It does not mean it's wrong. For example, in Leviticus, it talks about how if you touch a dead body, you have become unclean because a dead body is unclean. Now, does that mean I am in sin for touching a dead body? Well, I guess everybody who goes to a funeral, you're all sinning. And that's not what Leviticus is talking about at all. There is nothing wrong or sinful to be unclean. It is the normal part of life. The problem with cleanliness is not to be unclean, but to be unclean and enter into a holy place. That's sinful. That's what's considered wrong in the Israelite mind. Let me give you an example about this. Imagine if I invited you to my wedding. I'm like, guys, I've been single for like 40 years, and finally this is the big day. Like, come on, friends, let's come. This can be a grand celebration. And we make it like this huge, like formal festivity. You all come, and then one of you who are like one of my closest friends, you come, you're supposed to be a groomsman. We're all wearing our tuxes. You just come in a t-shirt and shorts and in sandals going, I'm here, what's up, let's do this. I'll be like, what are you doing? Again, nothing's wrong with wearing a t-shirt, wearing shorts or sandals, but wrong place, wrong time. This is a wedding. This is supposed to be my big day. That's supposed to be like the idea, right? Like you're supposed to honor this day, but for you to do that, like that's what makes it wrong. Or imagine you tell a hilarious joke. You just crack a joke in the middle of a funeral. It's like, man, there's nothing wrong with making a joke, but not at a funeral. Like that's just the wrong place at the wrong time. That's kind of a similar concept, this idea of clean, unclean, holy, and common. The problem, again, unclean is not wrong, but to have the uncleanness be in the place of holiness in any type of way, that is the big problem. And Yahweh's trying to teach them. You cannot be unclean and enter into my presence. You have to, in fact, be holy in order to be in the presence of a holy God. To kind of help flesh this out of like why this matters so much, I heard an illustration. I was like, this actually helped me a lot to kind of grasp the tabernacle and all these different like regulations or rules. Has anybody here in this room, how many of you have been in an operating room before? Like an operating room. All right, a few of us. Okay. I'm guessing the rest of us, how many of you have been in a hospital? Yeah, all of us, right? We're all born in a hospital. So all of us have been in a hospital. A few of us have been in an operating room. The reason why a few of us have been in the operating room is because that operating room is a special room. That room has a purpose. It's meant to be life-giving, to save or to help somebody's life to be restored, right? You can almost call that operating room that exists in a hospital, this is like a holy space. It's a space that has a unique purpose that is set apart for life-giving reasons. And not anybody could just enter into an operating room, right? It takes a set-apart people, a holy people, surgeons, nurses. Those are the only people who are able to enter into the operating room. And they can't just enter the operating room, but what must they do? They must take off their clothes. They must put on new clothes. They must wash their hands. They must put on their surgical gear before they enter into the operating room. Why? Germs. They want to prevent contamination from coming in. They want to prevent any dirtiness from coming into the room. And so if a doctor has like poop on his shoes, he has to take that off. If a doctor has the running nose, they can't operate. Or they have a pink eye, they can't do that. Because you don't want to infect the operating room that's meant to be life-giving, because if you do that, it no longer becomes life-giving, it becomes life-threatening. That's kind of the concept of how the tabernacle works. The tabernacle is meant to be this life-giving presence, the very presence of God that you cannot just enter, because we are contaminated with this thing called sin, death, chaos from this world. And we can't just bring that into God's presence. But instead, we are meant to have this idea that there's holy and common, clean and unclean. And we have to carefully know those categories before they enter into God's presence. Now, I know for some of us, again, as I describe all this sounds, okay, that's interesting. That's just a different world than what I'm used to. Let me just caveat that with a couple of things, a couple implications for us. One is that this challenges, I think, our Western culture a little bit, because this is so foreign to us, clean, unclean, and we think this is so weird. You ever consider we're the weird ones? That us Westerners not even understand this, we're kind of strange? Jonathan Haidt, he's a sociologist, he wrote this book called The Righteous Mind. It's really long, it's like 400 pages, but it all came for his one sermon illustration that I hope is worth it, that I read through. So Haidt, he argues, he did this project, and he tried to understand how Westerners view morality. And so he interviewed all these college students, these Western college students, and he told them a story. He said, I'm going to tell you a story. Tell me if this is wrong. A family found its family dog, dead in the driveway. Some car killed it. And the family, instead of burying it, they decided to cook it and eat it. Is that wrong? And all the college students in America, they're like, oh my gosh, that's gross. Why would they do that? He was like, yeah, I know it's gross, but is it morally wrong for this family to eat that dog? It's already dead. It's their dog. Is it morally wrong? And every Western college student, they all unanimously said, it's gross, but it's not morally wrong. I mean, it doesn't hurt anybody. Do what you got to do. In contrast, he interviewed all these Eastern folks from India, from Africa. He interviewed all these folks, same question, is it morally wrong? Unanimously, morally wrong. That family's going to hell. It's what in the world? Why the contrast? And it's because, in the East, they had this idea of pollution and cleanliness, of purity and impurity, this idea that your body's a temple, that you got to honor your body. And they see you defiling your body as categorically wrong. And so for us, it's really hard to see the Bible and think, this is so primitive, the Bible seems so removed. Who thinks like this? Most of the world thinks like this. We're kind of the strange ones, where we don't have a category other than if you're hurting another person or not hurting another person, that's the only measure of right or wrong. That's not how most of the world thinks. But for most of us, we're kind of stuck in that because that's how the West thinks. The Bible kind of opens and challenges our cultural lenses a bit to be a little bit more sensitive to how other nations and other cultures actually view morality. But not only does this challenge our view of culture, but I think this actually more deeply challenges our view of God. How many of us today have you grown up with this sentiment that, hey, you know what Christianity is? It's not a religion. Christianity, it's not a religion. It's a relationship. And all of us are yes. And again, there's truth to that, for sure. But now I would argue we found ourselves in an era of church where because we see Christianity as not religion, relationship, all reverence towards God has been transformed into just relationship with God. Any form of honoring God has been transformed with just the love of God, fully swung the other way. And so what happens is you just kind of sense it in the culture of the church and how people, especially in California, in Orange County, how many of us have a very casual view when it comes to even something like worship? I remember I had a friend who came from more of a high liturgy, Catholic, Episcopalian church. When they came to our church, they asked, hey, what's something you notice about our church? How casual it is. I was like, what do you mean? They're I can't believe so many people wear hats. And I was like, oh, I didn't even notice that. By the way, no shame wearing a hat. No shame to all the hat wearers. But they were just shocked. They're where's the honor for the Lord? I'm oh. And I took off my hat and I don't know. That's a good question. But that's just kind of the air we breathe, right? Just this casual approach to worship. Or if we do something sinful, it's like, oh man, I messed up. Oops. Oh, I better do better next time. This very casual approach to how Christians, we view the things that we know we shouldn't be doing. Or even like our spiritual practices, like, oh, I forgot to read my Bible and pray this past week. Oh, please remind me next time. It's like just this very casual approach. And what ends up happening is if you keep doing that, if that's kind of your posture towards who God is, then what ends up happening is you kind of reduce God to this small, nice guy who you turn to occasionally when you need him, and you lose the majesty and the bigness and who God presents himself to be in the actual Bible, which is he's holy. In fact, you should tremble when you come before him. Like you should come, again, I'm not saying this for our church, but if you come in, you gotta like walk in, this almost Leviticus saying, be very careful how you approach this God. And I think for a lot of us, that doesn't even make sense to us because we're so used to this casualness that's there. And so before we move on, can we actually recognize for a moment, do we consider, before even thinking about how we live a holy life, that God is holy and that we should treat him as holy? Where do you start? Is there anything you could do to just remember that he's a holy God? I remember when I had a college roommate, I went out with him and his family, and his dad, he was like in his 60s, and I noticed his dad, like he would open the car door for his mom every single time. And they're in their 60s. Most husbands stop that as soon as they get married. Like the car door opening stops. But in their 60s, and my friend's like, yep, he's been doing that ever since I was a kid. And I was like, why? And he's like, oh, that's just his way of reminding himself that mom is special. Mom is different than anyone else in the world. And it's just a small gesture, but a small way more so for the dad even, that this is a special woman in my life. Is there something for us, a small gesture where we can remember when we approach God, he's a holy God. He's someone that we should treat with reverence. It could be something small like, hey, Sunday worship. I almost never say this, but what if we came on time? What if we gathered on time for worship? If someone was important saying, let's meet at 9 o'clock, and they're really important to me, I will come at 8:55, not at 9:30. Imagine if we actually treated with reverence. This is a holy space that I have limited time with the Lord, and I'm going to meet him fully. Or imagine, I know when Sunday worship, one thing I'm so tempted to do, and when I'm preaching, I don't, I'm like, hey, pay attention, but when I'm sitting there, I get it. I am so tempted in the middle of worship. Just looking at my phone, because casually, multitasking, because I do this for everything else. When I do my laundry, when I wash the dishes, when I'm watching even the most entertaining movie, I am so tempted to do this. Imagine if I met with you for coffee and I said, hey, let's meet up. Hey, tell me, how are you these days? And I'm just doing this the whole time with you. What type of reverence do I show you? Am I honoring you in that moment? I make it a choice, or I make it a point as best as possible, especially when I'm not preaching. I just put my phone down. I just feel myself shaking. I just be engaged. Let this be the one time in the whole week I detox for just an hour from my phone, just to be engaged in reverence to a holy God. I'm not saying this is everything, but there's just small tokens of ways to remember who this God is, how I'm meant to approach him, what it means to be in the presence of a holy God. Do you view God as holy? That the only way you can make sense of all these regulations unless you see him as holy. Secondly, understanding holiness for us. Now that we have some context for tabernacle, holy, common, clean, unclean, let's look at these laws that are here. So again, chapters 11 and 15, wild stuff. You should read through it. It's crazy. It's a bunch of random things about animals you should eat, not eat, different diseases and so forth. Let me just break it down in summary what these chapters are saying. So Yahweh's pretty much saying these are clean, unclean categories. Chapter 11 is all about the animals. Yahweh's saying, hey, there's a list of animals that are clean, unclean. Animals you should eat, that you should not eat. And he breaks it down in further. Land animals, sky animals, water animals. And he lists out these are clean, these are not clean. Cows, all good. Pigs, no good. Fish, all good. Crabs, no good. It's like, what in the world? Like, what's wrong with eating a crab? And yet it's in the Bible. That's what it says for Israel. Interesting. Then you have chapter 12. Oh boy, childbirth. Women in Israel, if you were an Israelite back in the day, if you gave birth, you were considered unclean and you had to be quarantined for 40 to 80 days. That sounds interesting. That's crazy. Really? Just because I gave birth? Unclean. Chapter 13 to 14, it's all about skin diseases and molds. If you find a skin disease, eczema, something along those lines, or if you find mold in the house, you're considered unclean and you have to be quarantined. Chapter 15, bodily fluids. Ooh, this is the cringe part. If you have diarrhea, you're unclean. You can't come to the worship. So if anyone's missing Sunday worship, like, oh, diarrhea, like something happened to that person. Or if you emitted semen, if you had sex, unclean. If you're a woman, you had a menstrual monthly period, unclean. You have to be quarantined. That's the law. Now, this is all there. It's all in Leviticus. It's all in the Bible. This is why a lot of preachers don't go through this, because how do you explain this? How do you make sense of that? Because at first glance, this all seems so random, arbitrary, or even seems a little bit unfair. Like, why do these things make you unclean? And again, we have to pause a little bit and take a step back. We have to remember, being unclean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not saying you're in sin or it's wrong. There's nothing wrong with giving birth to a child. The Bible celebrates childbirth. There's nothing wrong with having sex. The Bible actually celebrates sex. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's not talking about sin. It's talking about, but you can't enter into a holy space, the tabernacle. You cannot enter into the presence of God in this state. That's the main thing Leviticus is trying to talk about. And the reason why it's trying to teach us something, this is Torah. It's trying to teach us a couple of things. Number one, Yahweh is holy. And it's telling us what that means. Yahweh, He is the author of life, of wholeness, of a life-giving God. And anything that resembles chaos, disorder, death, cannot be near Him, because He is the opposite of that. And all of these different laws are somehow connected to that idea. For example, the animals. Why are certain animals clean and not clean? Scholars debate this like crazy. The favorite argument that I've heard so far is this person by the name of Mary Douglas, and she talks about how certain animals represent chaos and certain animals represent orderliness. So for example, a bat is unclean. And Douglas argues, you know why? Because a bat, is it a sky animal or is it a land animal? It has wings, but it kind of looks like a mammal. It's kind of confusing. Or a crab, does that belong in the ocean or does it belong in the land? It's a little confusing. A fish with scales and fins, that's clearly a sea animal. But these other animals, a little bit confusing categories, and what's trying to communicate is, oh, these represent chaotic, this represents order. God, Genesis 1, He separates order from chaos, and He's trying to communicate, oh, certain animals that you eat, those are chaotic, these animals are clean, I am a God who is of order. And that's why He causes people. This is what He's trying to communicate to them. Or let's give childbirth. For a lot of us, this one is confusing, but it's because in the ancient Near East, for a mom to give birth, your risk of death was very high. To give birth is a high mortality rate for either the mom or for the child. You're at the moment of death. Today, we don't have to worry about that as much at all. Most of us were fine. Versus back then, good luck, you're about to give birth because we'll see if you make it. Because they didn't have the medicine that we had today. To be in a close encounter with death in that state, you can't be in the presence of God because God is life. He's the opposite of that. And that's what Yahweh is trying to communicate. Skin disease, mold, that's decay. That represents the world versus Yahweh. He, again, is life-giving, whole. That's meant to be stayed away from Him. Bodily fluids, for the menstrual period, that's blood that represents death. And God's saying that is the opposite of who Yahweh is. The semen part's a little bit tricky, right? Like, what is that? That's kind of a little bit strange. And the Israelite mindset is that semen is actually this life-giving fluid. To lose it, you're losing and draining of life. You're in a state of less life. And again, Yahweh, He is full of life. And so all these different laws, what they're trying to communicate about Yahweh is He is the opposite of everything unclean. Wholeness and chaos of the animals, He is of order. death and life of all this, of childbirth. He is the opposite. He is life. And again, there's wholeness and chaos, life and death. This is what's all trying to be communicated, these different laws and who Yahweh is. This is what it means for Yahweh to be holy. If you are Israel, know that Yahweh, he is a life-giving God. And stay away from everything that is the opposite of that. That's what these laws are trying to communicate. But not only that is it trying to show Yahweh is holy, but it's also trying to teach Israel and you, Israel. This is what it means for you to be holy. Look again in chapter 11, verse 44 to 45. This is the summary statement of this whole section. Verse 44 says, "For I am the Lord your God, so you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God, so you must be holy, because I am holy." This is something you don't just do at a tabernacle, but all of life. You have to just be mindful of this. And this shapes the Israelites like crazy of what it means to be holy, because this is in their everyday practical life. There's actually a seminary professor, he taught a class in Leviticus, and he told his class, hey guys, for 1 week, just try it. Follow all the Levitical laws and journal about it. And so all the students, they try to follow the Levitical laws, so they didn't eat pork. They make sure that there's a Levitical law, don't have 2 different types of cloths together. So the wardrobe, they had to stop wearing certain types of outfits. They had a skin disease, they're like, doctor, they had to go find a doctor just to make sure that it wasn't something too serious. And that was their whole week. And the professor, he got their journals back, and a lot of them expressed frustration, how annoying it was. But then one journal entry stood out, and she said it like this, quote, "Every day, I made decisions about the ritual purity and impurity, and by midweek, I realized I was thinking about these things all day long and in every aspect of my life, and that's when it hit me. God cares a lot about our purity and holiness." And she goes on, "All day long and in every aspect of my life, the Lord wants me to pursue purity in my heart, in my life, and in my actions. I have been treating holiness way too lightly, but he wants me to reflect his holiness in all that I do." And I think this is a true word for a lot of us here today, because as Christians, especially in today's modern context, we tend to treat holiness way too lowly, not because we don't have a high view of it, but because we compartmentalize holiness. For a lot of us, if we're honest, we have our spiritual lives, and then we have the rest of our life. Our spiritual life is our prayer life, our life at church, our life with Christian people, versus the rest of our life is our work, our relationships, our family, the way we treat our kids. And we kind of just divide it that way. Versus Leviticus describing holiness, it's actually saying there's no divisions like that in holiness. Holiness is all of life. Holiness encompasses and shapes everything and should influence every detail of your life. Now, what does that look like? Let's just look at the laws again. Animals. How on earth does this apply to me today? Well, think of it back then. Back then, animals was food. What you consumed, that's kind of what they had to make a choice of what they actually took in. And it's interesting, when you actually think about what you eat or not eat, that actually creates identity for you. I have my son's friends, they don't eat meat. Actually, no, they eat meat. They don't eat meat, but they eat seafood. So I think that's called what, a pescatarian? Something like that, right? One of those things. There's something, and they have an identity because of their diet. And that kind of communicates, the things we choose to do, the choices we make, it slowly creates an identity for you. And the question is that a holy identity, one that belongs to God, or one that belongs to the world? And we talk about this in our church all the time. Your choices, they become habits. Your habits, it becomes character. And your character becomes destiny. All the choices that you are making, every small one, how much of it is it shaped by God? Oh, that's going to determine if you're holy or not. Or let's take this one, skin diseases. Skin diseases, if you have a skin disease, it's not something that you talk about with friends. I mean, if I have a skin disease, I'm not going to go to a community group going, guys, low light of my week, I have a skin disease. I just won't go to community group. That's just things that we don't talk about. These things that happen to our body. And yet what Leviticus teaches us is holiness. It's not just this spiritual moral category. It's all of life. It's the messy parts of your lives, the parts of life that you don't necessarily want to share with others. And yet, holiness, it actually involves that in those weird, messy, dark times of your life, do you consider God and his presence and how he shapes you in the midst of the messiness? Do you invite him to that? Or bodily fluids, something that's so strange and we all feel uncomfortable when reading that. And yet one reason why is because we know that this is a vulnerable part of our lives. Our sexual organs, they're actually very vulnerable. Most people who have a broken life, who have some type of trauma in their life, especially today, it's often because of some sexual brokenness in their past. And God is saying, and I want holiness to be a part of that. I want to actually have something that belongs to me as well. The hurts and the pains and the deepest parts of your soul. Holiness, it goes from your choices, from the everyday external small acts that you make, to the things, the messy parts that you don't talk about with other people, to the deepest part of yourselves that you never dare go to with anybody else. God is saying holiness is when it is all of that being brought to the Lord, shaped and influenced by him. Last week we talked about holiness. It means you belong completely and exclusively to him. Is there any part of this where you have yet to give it to the Lord? Are your choices every day just devoid of God's presence? Are there parts of your life that you are just messy and it's, when you're doing well, God is good, but when you're not doing well, God is gone? Or is there a part of our lives, there's this deep stuff in you that you just have never brought to him? This is what holiness, how it plays out in your life. It's all of life that shapes the Christian. And when all of life is being shaped by holiness, that's when God feels near. That's when you experience his presence. And that leads to the last part, understanding Jesus, how this all connects to Jesus. So in the Old Testament, this idea of clean, unclean, it colored everything that the way Israelites understood life. So if you're an Israelite, you're just walking around going, this food, clean, unclean, can't eat that. You're just thinking that way. It's kind of sad. If you're unclean, you have to actually scream going, I'm unclean. And everyone goes, unclean. And they all walk away. It's like COVID, right? Back in the day. Like, I have COVID. It's like, he has COVID. And you just stay away. That was just the norm back in the day. Because if you touch something unclean, you got exposed to something unclean, or if you became unclean, you must stay away from the presence of God. You have to quarantine. You have to be far away to go through this whole purification process to be brought near. And everybody wanted to avoid that. That was just the way it happened back in the day. That was the context of the Bible. And when you understand that context, man, does the story of the Bible get illuminated. Because what happens is Leviticus, 500 years later, so 500 years of people getting clean, unclean, and there's just the normality that's there. There was a prophet, his name is Isaiah, and there's a very famous passage where he has a vision, Isaiah chapter 6. And this vision, if you read it without context, you go, okay, cool. But the context, the vision becomes this mind-blowing thing. So Isaiah chapter 6, it reads, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Isaiah has this vision, and he sees the Lord, he sees the temple, and he realizes, oh my gosh, I am in the Holy of Holies. I'm in the literal presence of God. And do you remember what Isaiah says next after this? He says, woe is me, I am ruined, I'm a man of what? Unclean lips. He looks at, I'm not clean, because he's a Jew. He knows that he's not meant to be there. And so what's going to happen is either the whole temple becomes unclean or he's going to die. Something's going to happen. But then the unexpected takes place in verse 6 to 7, where all of a sudden it says, then one of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand was a glowing coal that had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth, the unclean thing, and it said, now that has touched your lips, your iniquity is removed. Again, first glance, you think, what's the big deal? But Jewish mind, this is crazy. Wait a second. If you touch something unclean, you become unclean. That's the way the game is. But what's happening here is this person who's unclean, he becomes holy. It doesn't work that way. What is going on? And this is the vision that Isaiah had. It's just this random thing. It's like, what is that? It's in the Bible, but that's crazy. And we just see this random moment happen out of nowhere that we don't touch upon until 700 years later. A person named Jesus comes, who's literally called Emmanuel, God with us. And what's so fascinating about Jesus is that when he comes, the pure presence of God, and he says, the kingdom of God is here. Do you remember the first stories that take place in Jesus' kingdom life? The first people he goes to are who? Lepers. Skin disease. And he goes. And when he touches them, what's supposed to happen is Jesus becomes unclean. And he can't enter temple. But what happens to the lepers? They become clean. In fact, Jesus goes to them to heal them. And it's crazy when you see this, it just illuminates the entire New Testament, because who are the people Jesus is reaching out to? It seems random, but a bleeding woman? That's such a random disease. Someone who is dead, he raises. Someone who's went through death, what is going on? The gospel writers are looking at Leviticus 11 to 15 and just checking it off. These people who are unclean, 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 Jesus makes them clean. Jesus makes them clean. Jesus makes them clean. He is reversing all that the Jewish people understood about these categories of clean and unclean. The things that would make you dirty, that made you far away from God, Jesus actually draws close and is going near that person, bringing them to the presence of God. This is who Jesus is. He reverses the whole Levitical system. He is the game changer. And you know what this tells us? This tells us that for us here in this room, a lot of you might have done things that you deep down know you messed up on in your past, in this past season, this past week. They're just things that you've done that makes you feel dirty, or that makes you feel like, I'm not really sure if people knew if I did this, that they would accept me here. Like, why am I even here? I'm just going to go through the motions just to do my religious checkoff. And that's just kind of the mentality that we have. Because we have in our brain that, God is kind of low-key disappointed in us. And I have to kind of quarantine myself when I do something wrong. I have to kind of be right with God internally. I have to do something, I have to serve in a ministry before I could be right with him. Like Leviticus, it seems primitive, but it's very modern. Like when you do something wrong, like we don't feel like we could come to church for like a while. Like you have to quarantine for 40 days. If you mess up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or if you go out and do something crazy in the weekend, you feel like I need a little bit of break from Christian people, from like the pastors and from churchy stuff, because who am I to come near God's presence? That's just kind of the way we think about it. And we have this line in our brain where it's because God is holy and he can't stand the presence of sin. And that just like drives us away from church. And let me just tell you, that is something that Jesus passionately disagrees with. Passionately. Jesus is not scared of your sins. The idea that God is holy and he can't stand the presence of your sin, that is a half-truth. It's true, and the devil uses many people to draw away from church because of that half-truth. Jesus draws near to the leper. He draws near to the bleeding woman. He draws near to the brokenhearted. He draws near to those who are in the most deepest, dirtiest, shameful things that they think they might have done. He draws near to that. He is the opposite of what that Levitical system was actually trying to show. This is the idea God is holy, we don't deserve him, and yet Jesus, he draws us to this holy God. And so for some of us here, if there is something in our lives that we feel that we have been going through, that we've done, or that's holding us back from drawing near from God, if I could just give a word of encouragement, Leviticus might make you feel confirmed that, yes, I should stay away from God for a while. But I hope Jesus and the gospel could tell you, but no, through Christ, you are welcomed in his presence. If you come before him, offer your life to him, see him as your sacrificial offering, God welcomes you into his presence. And so can I pray for us as we close our time together? Let's all pray.